It all began on a lovely Tuesday day. The light poured through my living room's lace curtains, creating patterns on the coffee table where I had carelessly placed a book. I suddenly regret leaving this book out in the open. The cover was visually arresting, with crimson lettering spelling out a title that left no room for interpretation. Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. Julian stepped into the kitchen as I was cooking tea. He was not meant to be home. College studies normally kept him out until late in the evening, yet there he was, tall and thin, with that youthful curiosity that made him appear younger than his 21. He halted at the table, his attention fixed on the book. I saw the moment out of the corner of my eye, his brow furrowing in surprise, before one of his lips curved upward in what could only be described as a grin. "Interesting choice," he said, holding up the book. His tone was nonchalant, but his eyes twinkled with delight. Or was there something else? I felt heat rise up my neck. I turned to face him and claimed that it was for study. "I am modifying it for a customer." "Really?" He turned over the pages, scanning a paragraph and shutting it with a decisive snap. "It looks like inspiration rather than research." I chuckled, but it sounded too strained to be credible. Avoid judging a book by its cover. But his smile persisted, and I couldn't avoid the impression that he was criticizing more than just the book. He placed it back down, his fingertips brushing against the table for a fraction of a second longer than required, before strolling away with the same smirk. As the door to his room clicked shut, I inhaled, attempting to calm the anxiety in my chest. I wasn't troubled by the book itself. Things were how he viewed that, at me, as if he saw something I wasn't prepared to recognize. That moment marked the start of something I never expected. I couldn't have stopped it even if I'd tried. Looking back, I'm wondering whether I left the book there on purpose. If anything, I wanted him to find it and stare at me in a way that no one else had in years. My days had settled into a familiar pattern. The mornings began with a steamy cup of coffee, followed by hours spent crouched over manuscripts. My red pen circled faults and suggested changes. Being a freelance book editor has some advantages. It provided me with flexibility and privacy, but it also left me yearning for something I couldn't quite describe. Maybe that's why I was so negligent with the book on Tuesday. Julian had returned a few months ago. He needed a place to stay while finishing his final year of college, and I couldn't say no. It was a large mansion, far too vacant since my late husband, Charles, went away. I told myself it was great to have someone around again, even if Julian and I were never especially close. Our exchanges were courteous, but infrequent. He was either engrossed in his studies or out with buddies. I gave him space, and he returned the favor. But after the book incident, something changed. Julian stepped in the next morning when I was sitting at the dining table, revising a particularly uninteresting book about corporate leadership. He was dressed in sweats and a t-shirt, his hair still disheveled from sleep. I hardly looked up, expecting him to get his cereal before disappearing. Instead, he lingered. He began talking about the book while leaning comfortably on the counter. I froze, my pen poised over the paper. "How about it?" He shrugged, but his eyes showed a spark of intrigue. I looked it up. "It seems distinct from what you generally work on." I groaned and placed the pen down. "Not every endeavor can be exciting, Julian. It is simply another job, right?" He nodded, but did not depart. Instead, he made himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. "So, what is it about?" I hesitated, wondering how to respond. It is a novel about relationships, focusing on ties later in life. "Relationships, huh?" He smirked, making my cheeks blush. "Yes," I said forcefully, attempting to terminate the topic. But Julian didn't appear discouraged. After a lengthy drink of coffee, he stated, "I believe people underestimate how complex relationships can be at any age." He spoke in a nonchalant tone, yet the way he spoke made my stomach turn. I managed a grin, dismissing his remarks as a passing remark, but as the days passed, I saw him studying me more intently. One evening, I found him in the living room. He was splayed out on the couch with his laptop, while my book sat on the coffee table. He wasn't reading it, but its existence seemed intentional, like a subtle challenge. "Are you loving my goods right now?" I inquired, half joking, as I entered the room. He looked up, unbothered. "I'm just wondering if you left it out again." I crossed my arms. "It's not exactly your kind of reading material. Perhaps I'm widening my horizons." His gaze met mine, and for a second, the space felt too tiny. I attempted to shrug it off, murmuring something about him needing to broaden his views elsewhere, but the tension persisted. If anything, it lingered, becoming heavier with each subsequent contact. By the end of the week, I found myself thinking about Julian at unexpected times. It wasn't only his appearance, though he was clearly attractive with his sharp features and confident posture. It was his sudden alertness, the way he appeared to notice things no one else did, such as the day he complimented my hair. I'd spent some additional time combing it out, hoping to feel less invisible. He commented, "Your hair looks nice like that," as he passed me in the corridor. It was a simple comment, yet it took me off guard. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer than I had intended. These moments were modest and meaningless on the surface, yet they added up like droplets of water in a glass. I told myself it was nothing and that I was overthinking. But deep down, I sensed something had changed between us. The house was not as quiet as it used to be, and it wasn't simply because Julian was there. It was the unspoken words, the lingering stares, and the us. My heart raced when I caught his gaze. Julian returned to the living room late one evening. The home was peaceful, with the only sound being the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. While working on my study, I felt the urge to take a break and grab some water. Passing by, I noticed a lamp's brightness illuminating his face as he sat on the couch, the book open in his hands. For a second, I stood still in the doorway, my breath seizing. He had not just been flicking through the pages. He was reading it, his forehead wrinkled with concentration. I could see a little movement in his lips as he silently murmured the words. He'd had this unconscious tendency since he was a youngster. "Interesting bedtime story?" I asked, leaning against the frame and attempting to appear casual. He looked up, surprised, but soon recovered. "It's unusual," he confessed, shutting the book while keeping his thumb between the pages. Much more honest than I expected. "Honest?" I raised an eyebrow as I stepped inside the room. He nodded. "Yes, it's raw. About love, attraction, and the nasty things that no one talks about." I sat in the armchair opposite him, crossed my legs, and pretended that his comments had no effect on me. That is the purpose of excellent writing, Julian, to examine the subjects that people are too terrified to utter aloud. "And you're okay with all of this?" His gaze fixed on mine, his tone inquisitive. I paused. "It is not about comfort. It is important to grasp different points of view, even if they are uncomfortable for you." For a minute, he said nothing, his stare fixed. Then, almost casually, he inquired, "Do you believe individuals can experience that level of enthusiasm at any age?" I was caught aback, uncertain how to respond. I firmly believe that passion is boundless. "Why are you asking?" He shrugged, yet there was something purposeful about his casualness. "I'm just interested. It's not something most people my age think about." "You'd be shocked," I whispered, the words spilling out before I could catch them. Our eyes met again, and the air between us seemed to move, carrying an unsaid message. I hastily stood, wiping imaginary lint from my sweatshirt. "Don't stay awake too late. You have class in the morning." "Good night, Eleanor," he whispered softly, his voice resonating down the corridor. The next day, I found myself repeating our chat, analyzing his words and their potential implications. Was he just interested, or was there anything more behind his questions? That evening, while I was sitting at my computer attempting to concentrate on a novel, I heard a tap on the door. Julian entered, bringing 2 mugs of tea. He remarked, "I figured you could use a break," and laid one down next to me. "Thank you," I said, shocked. He lingered with his hands in his pockets. "May I ask you something?" I nodded nervously. "That book, why did you choose to work on it? I mean, you could have passed it forward to someone else, right?" I paused, wondering how much to reveal. "It's personal, I suppose, not the content, but the principle behind it. I believe that everyone, regardless of age, deserves to see themselves mirrored in tales." "That makes sense," he remarked, drawing out a chair to sit across from me. "But does this imply you recognize yourself in it?" His inquiry threw me off guard, and for a time, I had no idea how to react. "I believe everyone can connect to some aspect of it," I stated thoughtfully. He did not press more, but the expression in his eyes told me he was dissatisfied with my response. Julian's interest developed during the course of the next week. He began asking me questions about other works I'd worked on, as well as my opinions on love and relationships. At first, I attributed it to his curious nature, but as his queries got more precise, I couldn't deny the underlying sense of something more. One afternoon, I saw him looking at me as I was reading on the terrace. He was supposed to be studying, but his textbook was neglected on his lap. When I glanced up, he didn't look away. "You're distracted," I added, attempting to maintain a light tone. "Perhaps," he conceded, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Is there something on your mind?" He hesitated before responding. "Do you ever consider starting over and meeting someone new?" The question was so unexpected that I had no idea how to answer. "That's complicated," I admitted finally. "Life is typically like that," he responded, rising and walking inside before I could finish speaking. As the days passed, I became more conscious of Julian's presence, his inquiries, his glances, and the way he seemed to listen to everything I said. It was as if he was removing layers that I had not been aware were there, and I could not refute it. I didn't resent the attention. The air between us had been heated for days, but neither of us recognized it openly. The unsaid tension persisted like a static current throughout the home, rising stronger with each exchanged gaze and snatched moment. That Saturday, I decided to do some long overdue library organizing. Books were dispersed throughout the shelf. A jumbled collection of old novels, college textbooks, and different anthologies I'd accumulated throughout the years. I had just finished sorting a stack when Julian stepped in, barefoot and dressed casually in pants and a gray t-shirt. "Need help?" he offered with a casual tone. "Sure," I said, wiping a piece of hair from my face. "But I must tell you that this is a full-day project." "I've got time," he said, edging closer. We worked side by side for several hours, exchanged casual talk on everything from his academics to my editing tasks. The tension that had previously persisted in the air appeared to dissipate as we concentrated on the work at hand. It seemed nearly natural, the type of pleasant contact I had ceased anticipating. But the comfort did not last. As I reached for a book on the high shelf, Julian went forward to assist. His hand brushed against mine for longer than required. The warmth of his flesh jolted me, and I backed away as if scorched, holding the book to my breast. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice gentle and compassionate. "It's all right," I answered hastily, turning aside to cover the color on my cheeks. But it wasn't okay. That little contact had reawakened something I had frantically tried to ignore. My pulse raced, my skin tingled, and every nerve in my body seemed to come alive as it hadn't in years. After then, everything changed. Julian became more attentive, seeking ways to be near me. He volunteered to assist with housework, gave me coffee in the mornings, and hung out in the kitchen while I cooked. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling, and I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. One evening, I discovered him in the living room, doodling in a notebook. "I didn't realize you drew," I remarked, sitting on the arm of the couch. "It's just a pastime," he explained, flipping the page so I couldn't see. "Let me see," I teased while reaching for the notepad. He hesitated before handing it up, his countenance opaque. The illustrations were lovely. Portraits, landscapes, and moments are caught in subtle lines and shadows. But one sketch caused me to halt. It was a woman with her back turned and hair streaming over her shoulders. "It's stunning," I remarked, running my fingertips along the edge of the page. "It's you," he remarked gently. I looked up, gathering my breath. "Me?" He nodded, his gaze catching mine. "I've been painting you for weeks, and you're inspirational." The space felt smaller, and the air was heavier. I returned the notepad, unsure of what to say. "Thank you." My voice scarcely rose beyond a whisper. The days that followed were filled with intense emotion. I could not stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, and the way he looked at me made me feel like the only thing that mattered. It was simultaneously exhilarating and horrifying. One afternoon, I resolved to face him, to stop whatever was going on before it got out of control. I discovered him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and holding a glass of water. "Julian, we need to talk," I murmured calmly, despite the tumult inside me. "Okay," he responded, putting down the drink and giving me his whole attention. "This, whatever it is, needs to stop. It is inappropriate." He grimaced, his brows pulled together. "I do not comprehend." "What exactly are you talking about?" "You understand precisely what I am talking about." I spoke with a stronger tone than I intended. The appearance, the touches, everything. He moved closer, his expression softening. "Eleanor, I won't do anything you don't want." My breath caught as he reached out and brushed stray hair off my face. "If I'm incorrect, tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I should have pushed away and informed him he was mistaken, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me by leaning into his contact as if it had anticipated this moment all along. "Julian?" I began, but any argument I had died on my lips as his fingers caressed my cheek was incorrect. I knew it was wrong, but as his lips touched mine, all of the reasons seemed to evaporate, replaced by a passion that devoured me. When I eventually drew away, my head was filled with remorse and want. "This cannot happen again," I said, my voice quivering. "Why not?" he inquired, his tone calm yet strong. "Because it's not correct." "So why didn't you stop me?" I had no response, no resistance against the truth of his comments. I turned and went out of the room, but I knew it wasn't finished. Definitely not. The level of tension in the house had escalated significantly. Every gaze, inadvertent touch, and word we shared seemed to have more weight than it should. I avoided being alone with Julian whenever possible, but it didn't matter. His presence was omnipresent, in my thoughts, dreams, and waking moments. The border was ultimately crossed on a wet evening. Water pelting at the windows, broke the stillness as I sat in the kitchen, drinking a drink of wine after a difficult day. My work had been rejected by a very demanding customer, and the weight of it was bearing down on me. I didn't hear Julian enter until he was already standing at the doorway. "You okay?" he asked softly. I looked up, surprised, but soon collected myself. "I'm all right. It's just been a hard day." He walked inside. His socks muffled his footsteps. "Want to discuss it?" I shook my head, hoping to evade his sight. "No, it is nothing." He did not depart. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his gaze fixed on mine. "You've been distant," he remarked after a pause. "I've been busy," I said, but even I could hear the untruth in my voice. He addressed Eleanor with a kind but stern tone. "Talk to me." I groaned and leaned back in my chair. "It's complex, Julian. Work, life, everything seems so heavy nowadays." He stretched out and covered my hand. "You do not have to carry it alone." His touch was warm and anchoring, and I allowed myself to lean into it for a moment. I stated that I had been carrying things alone for quite some time, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to anymore," he whispered, stroking his thumb on my knuckles. The words hung between us, full of unsaid meaning. I glanced up at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to view him as a man rather than my stepson. "Julian," I started, but he interrupted me. His voice was low and steady. "Tell me to go, and I will. But if you do not want me to, I will not." He didn't continue the phrase, and he didn't have to. The option was mine, and I knew exactly what I wanted, something I'd desired for weeks, but had been too terrified to express. I did not tell him to go. The first kiss was cautious, a gentle kiss that sent chills down my spine. I backed away, scanning his eyes for doubt or hesitation, but there was none. He gazed at me with a confidence that startled and delighted me. When he kissed me again, it was deeper and more intense. His hands reached my waist, bringing me closer while the world outside faded away. My glass of wine spilled over, spreading crimson liquid all over the table, but none of us noticed. We didn't make it into the bedroom that night. As we succumbed to the long, simmering longing between us, the kitchen became our shelter, our secret. The next morning, I awoke in my own bed, recalling the events of the night before. My mind is reliving itself like a dream. But this wasn't a dream. The lingering warmth on my skin, the faint perfume of him on my pillow, it was all too real. I persuaded myself that it was a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness that would never happen again. But as Julian strolled into the kitchen, his hair moist from the shower and a little smile on his lips, I realized it wasn't that easy. "Morning," he remarked in a casual tone. "Morning," I said, my voice trembling. He leaned against the counter and watched me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Are we going to discuss last night?" "There's nothing to discuss," I responded hastily, returning my focus to the coffee pot. "Eleanor." His voice was faint, yet it held enough weight to make me halt. "Do not pretend it did not happen." I turned to face him with my arms crossed defensively. "What would you like me to say to Julian? Leon? Was it a mistake? That it cannot happen again? Was this an error?" He questioned, his gaze fixed on mine. I opened my lips to reply, but nothing came out. I had no idea how to respond because I knew it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had seemed inevitable. Over the following few days, we danced around each other, stuck in a state of yearning and denial. Every touch, gaze, and accidental brush of flesh just fueled the flames. Julian came to the doorway of my study one evening while I was working late. "Can I come inside?" he inquired. I only nodded, unable to find my voice. He walked inside and closed the door behind him. "I can't stop thinking about you," he acknowledged, his voice low and full of passion. "Julian, we cannot." "Why not?" he interjected, taking a step closer. "Because it's incorrect. Because you are terrified of what others would think? None of this matters to me, Eleanor. You are important." His words cut through my barriers, and before I could stop myself, I was back in his arms. This time, there was no hesitancy or second-guessing. As the night progressed, the restrictions we had previously adhered to vanished completely. The days after that night were hazy with snatched moments and silent desire. What began as an impulsive choice, a kiss in the kitchen on a wet evening, grew into something none of us could control. Julian and I were attracted together like magnets, the attraction too powerful to resist, no matter how wrong it felt. We became masters of concealment. Our friendship remained in the shadows, concealed behind shuttered doors and murmured words. When the home was vacant, we would meet in the quiet nooks where no one could interfere. My workplace became our refuge, a place where we could exist without being judged, at least for a short time. I'd sit at my desk, appearing to be productive, while Julian stood behind me, his hands softly resting on my shoulders. At times, he would gently press his lips against my neck, causing shivers to run down my spine. Sometimes he'd kneel alongside me, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm as we spoke about everything and nothing. Julian suggested we go for a drive on a particularly warm afternoon. "Somewhere away from here," he murmured, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. We found ourselves at a remote park on the outskirts of town, where the trees formed a green canopy over us. As we strolled hand in hand along the meandering trails, the world seemed distant and almost surreal. "Does this seem unusual to you?" I asked. I spoke in a barely audible whisper. He paused, turning to face me. "What do you mean?" "This." I motioned between us. "United States." He moved a step closer, his hands touching mine. "It feels like the most genuine thing I've ever experienced." His remarks dispelled my doubts, at least for the moment. We sat on a wooden bench, birdsong filling the air, and he placed his arm over my shoulders. I lay my head on him, allowing myself to believe, even only briefly, that this was typical. Despite our best efforts to conceal our affair, cracks began to appear in our carefully crafted veneer. It began with Mrs. Harrington, our excessively nosy neighbor, who had an amazing capacity to come at awkward moments. Julian left the house for class one morning, and she waved at him from her porch with a knowing smile. "Julian seemed to be around a lot more these days," she said later, when I ran into her at the grocery store. "He is such a dedicated stepson." Her words were benign, but how she uttered them made my stomach turn. I smiled nicely and changed the subject, but the experience made me nervous. Then there was Julian's best buddy, Liam, who stopped over one evening to study. I remained out of their path, returning to my office, but I couldn't ignore the whispered talk that echoed through the walls. "You've been acting strangely lately," Liam remarked, like distracted. Julian's remark was too faint for me to hear, but whatever he said did not appear to satisfy Liam. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Liam pressed. "If something is going on." Their chat came to an abrupt stop when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on my desk. A few minutes later, Julian came in my doorway, his look opaque. "Is everything okay?" I inquired, trying a grin. "Yes," he said, though his tone was strained. "Liam is simply nosy." I didn't go any farther, but the strain in his voice stayed in the back of my mind. Our most adventurous encounter occurred one evening while I was scheduled to meet a customer at the library. The appointment was canceled at the last minute, so I chose to stay and shop. The library had always been a safe haven for me, a place where I could immerse myself in the peaceful comfort of literature. I hadn't expected Julian to show up. "What are you doing here?" I inquired, my tone a mixture of astonishment and excitement. "I was passing past," he replied with a sly grin. "I thought I would find you here." We walked through the aisles together, our shoulders touching as we took books from the racks. He kissed me in a secluded corner of the library, hidden from view, his hands cradling my face while the outer world drifted away. "This is insane," I muttered against his lips. Maybe he murmured quietly, "But it's ours." As the weeks passed, the stakes rose. The more time we spent together, the more difficult it got to keep our emotions buried. Julian didn't seem concerned about the hazards, but I couldn't ignore them. The worry of being detected hovered over me like a thundercloud, growing darker with each passing day. It wasn't only the worry of what others would think, it was the realization that this could not endure. Julian was young, with his entire life ahead of him. I was not. Our age gap was more than a number. It was a divide that I knew we couldn't cross forever. However, for the time being, I cherished our shared moments, treating them as precious treasures. I promised myself that I would terminate it shortly. I'd figure out a way to let him go before it was too late. Julian used his fingertips to trace circles on my arm one evening while we were intertwined on the couch. "I do not want this to end," he replied gently. "Julian," I started, but he cut me off. "I mean it, Eleanor. I understand it's difficult, but I don't care. I don't care about the rules or what others may think. I care about you." His words shattered something within me. I wanted to believe him and let myself fall fully. However, the voice of reason in my thoughts would not be muted. "I care about you too," I said, my voice wavering. "However, you are aware that this is not sustainable." "We'll figure it out," he continued, his tone determined. I wanted to trust him, but deep down I knew the truth. Our relationship was akin to a fire, intense, captivating, yet destined for extinguishment. The certainty of discovery stayed in my thoughts like a shadow, but I told myself that we were cautious enough to prevent it. It wasn't simply the thought of other people finding out that worried me. It was the notion of what would happen to Julian and to us if the delicate equilibrium we had maintained collapsed. The first break in our veneer appeared on an unremarkable afternoon. Mrs. Harrington came to the door while I was in the kitchen making lunch. She seldom paid surprise visits, so her abrupt arrival made me nervous. "I just stopped by to return your pie plate," she replied with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "And to check in with you. Julian's automobile has been around a lot lately. I hope he is not causing you too many problems." Her tone was nonchalant, but her comments included an undertone that made my stomach knot. "No problem at all," I responded, feigning a grin. "He is busy with school, but it is good to have him around." "Good," she said, her stare staying on me for too long before handing me the plate and leaving. I closed the door. My heart is pounding. She knew something, perhaps not the whole truth, but enough to raise my suspicions. Later that evening, Julian and I sat in the living room, with the television on in the background. I informed him about Mrs. Harrington's visit, hoping to measure his reaction. "She's just nosy," he muttered dismissively, but the strain in his shoulders belied his cool manner. "It's not only her, Julian," I added, dropping my voice. "People are starting to notice. We cannot keep doing this." He turned to face me, his eyes bright with intent. "I don't care what others think, Eleanor. I care about you." His remarks were intended to reassure me, but they simply made me more anxious. Things took an abrupt turn when Julian's best buddy, Liam, dropped by unexpectedly one evening. I was studying when I heard their quiet, earnest voices in the living room. Liam remarked, "You've been acting weird, man. Like, truly odd." "What's happening?" "Nothing," Julian said, but his tone was defensive. "Don't lie to me," Liam pushed. "Is this about Eleanor?" My breath caught. I moved closer to the door, straining to hear. "How about her?" Julian inquired, his voice firm yet cautious. "I don't know," Liam said. "You just don't seem like yourself with her. It's as if you're concealing something." Julian did not react, and the stillness continued until Liam groaned. "If there is something going on, just be cautious, okay? People speak." The true unraveling began when I was offered a job at a famous publishing business in another state. It was the chance I had been hoping for years, but accepting it would mean leaving everything behind, even Julian. When I informed him about the opportunity, he reacted immediately. "You're going?" he inquired, his voice harsh with surprise. "I haven't decided yet," I said calmly. "You're fleeing," he claimed, standing and pacing the room. "Julian, this is my career," I explained. "I'm fighting to get him to comprehend. I've worked so hard for this." "So what about us?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "There cannot be a us," I murmured gently. The words lingered in the air, like a knife between us. He looked at me, his face a combination of hurt and rage. In the days that followed, we seldom talked. As our distance grew, the home felt colder and emptier. I spent my nights going over the specifics of the job offer, trying to persuade myself that it was the proper decision. But one night, as I was sitting at my work, Julian arrived at the doorway. "I am not giving up on you," he said. His voice remained firm, despite the turbulence in his eyes. "Julian, please," I said, but he shook his head. "I don't care how complex it is," he stated. "Eleanor, I love you." The words struck me like a tsunami, powerful and obvious. The gravity of our position prevented me from telling him that I also loved him. The turning point occurred when I discovered that Mrs. Harrington had conversed with one of my clients during an accidental meeting at the grocery store. During a phone chat, my client casually remarked that your stepson lives with you. She appeared intrigued by your dynamic. I hung up with my hands shaking. It was inevitable that the rumors would proliferate, and our confidential information would become public knowledge. When Julian arrived home that evening, I told him everything. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice cracking. "It is too hazardous." "Eleanor, I don't care what others say," he added. His voice was laced with desperation. "But I do," I said, tears flowing down my cheeks. For the first time, I noticed terror in his eyes. He went closer, his hands cupping my face and whispering, "I can't lose you." "You never had me to begin with," I murmured, my words hitting more than I intended. The confrontation devastated both of us. Julian went to his room, and I spent the night looking at the ceiling, wondering how we had let things get this far. By the time the light came up, I'd made my decision. The morning following my sleepless night, I decided to put a stop to everything. The affair, the secrecy, the moments that made me feel alive after years. It all had to end. The risk was too high, and the devastation we would inflict was too severe. Julian entered from his room just as I completed making myself a cup of coffee. His hair was messy, and the dark bags beneath his eyes reflected my own tiredness. "We need to talk," I replied, placing the cup down. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. "This cannot continue," I said, my hands quivering as I clenched them together. "It's not fair to you or me." "Fair," he repeated, his tone tinged with irritation. "Since when has this been about fairness?" "Julian?" "No, let Julian? Ish," he said, his voice rising. I understand that this is not usual. I know most people would not comprehend, but I'm not concerned about them. I care about us." His comments triggered something deep within me, a mix of desire and remorse. But I couldn't let myself be persuaded. "There is no us," I replied quietly, my voice cracking. This was an error. His demeanor shifted, and the pain in his eyes penetrated me deeply. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice shaking. "I do." I lied. Despite my heart's protests, I forced myself to speak. "Julian, you need to move on. Find someone your age who can help you live the life you deserve." He stood hastily, scraping his chair against the floor. "You don't get to judge what I deserve," he screamed, his voice brimming with rage. I watched helplessly as he rushed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The hush that ensued was deafening. For the first time in months, the home felt utterly empty. I tried to concentrate on work, but my mind kept returning to Julian, where he had gone, what he was thinking, and whether I had made the correct decision. Hours passed with no word from him. I resisted the impulse to contact him, convincing myself that he needed time to comprehend things. But as night fell, my concerns mounted. Finally, soon after midnight, the sound of the front door opening interrupted my restless thoughts. I raced into the living room, relief coursing through me as I spotted Julian standing there. His shoulders fell and his countenance was tired. "Where have you been?" I demanded, my tone betraying my anxiety. "Out," he said curtly, avoiding my eyes. "Julian?" "I'm finished speaking," he replied, cutting me short. "I get it, Eleanor. You do not want this. You do not want me." His comments pierced my heart, yet I refrained from correcting him. How could I, given that I'd already made my decision? He passed past me, straight to his room, without saying anything. The sound of his door closing seemed to be the final blow to our shared life. The following several days were terrible. Julian seldom spoke to me, and when he did, his remarks were clipped and distant. The home felt colder and emptier, as if life had been sucked from it. I pushed myself into work, believing it would divert me, but even that was ineffective. My mind was occupied with recollections of him. His touch, his grin, the way he looked at me as if I were the most important thing. One evening, I received an unexpected phone call from the publishing business, giving me the position. The editor on the other end was kind and eager, going over the specifics of the post and underlining how much they were looking forward to having me on board. "It's a huge opportunity," she says. "We hope you will accept." I thanked her and vowed to make my decision soon, but as I hung up, the weight of the decision before me felt oppressive. That night, Julian confronted me. "I saw the email," he began, standing at the doorway of my study. "What email address?" I asked, pretending ignorance. He said, "The one about the job," as he entered. "You're taking it, right?" I groaned and set down my pen. "Julian, this is not about you." "Of course it's about me," he said, his voice rising. "You're fleeing because of what occurred between us." "I'm taking the job because it's an excellent opportunity," I stated confidently. "It has nothing to do with you." "Stop lying," he replied, his tone full of anguish. "Eleanor, you're terrified of what others will think and how much you care about me." His remarks were uncomfortably close to the truth, so I glanced aside, unable to meet his eyes. I responded, "You're wrong," but my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" he challenged, moving closer. "Tell me you have no feelings for me. Tell me last night was meaningless." I opened my lips to answer, but no words emerged. The stillness between us was thick and suffocating. "I thought so," he responded, his tone softening. "You may lie to yourself, but not to me." Julian exited the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I glanced at the email on my computer screen, the cursor flickering as if waiting for my choice. I knew what I needed to do. The day I departed, the weather was dismal and cloudy, making everything feel heavier. I packed my belongings discreetly, not wanting to disturb Julian. He hadn't said much to me since our last quarrel, and part of me hoped the quiet was his way of letting go. The publishing business had arranged for a relocation agency to assist me in settling into my new home. As I carried the final box into the car, I halted and looked back at the home. The events of the previous months played over in my head like a film reel. The laughs, the debates, and the stolen moments had defined us. Julian arrived in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He appeared exhausted, his normal confidence replaced with something softer and more vulnerable. "You're really leaving," he remarked, his tone flat. I nodded, wondering what to say. "For whatever it's worth." He proceeded, drawing closer. "I have no regrets about any of it." His comments hit me like a blow in the stomach. I admitted that neither do I, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a time, the weight of what we couldn't say hanging between us. I finally stretched out, my fingers brushing against his. "Julian, take care of yourself," I murmured with tears in my eyes. "You too," he said, his voice full of emotion. I wanted to say more. I tried to tell him how much he meant to me, but the words didn't come. Instead, I got in my car and drove away, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the man I had fallen for. The weeks that followed were a flurry of meetings, deadlines, and settling into my new life. The work was all I had hoped for, difficult and rewarding in ways I hadn't felt in years. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the emptiness in my chest. Every now and again, I'd find myself thinking about Julian, wondering what he was up to, if he was happy, and whether he thought of me as much as I did of him. One evening, while I went around the city, I came across a bookstore. The storefront displayed a collection of publications, their colorful covers luring passers-by. My attention was drawn to one book in particular, Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. The memories of that tragic day flooded back, causing me to smile. The book had been the catalyst, the spark that started something neither of us could have predicted. I strolled inside, running my fingertips down the book spines as I walked through the aisles. For a while, I allowed myself to envision a different version of our narrative, one in which the world was less confusing and we might have been together without fear or judgment. However, life was not a novel, and happy endings were not guaranteed. As the months and years passed, I carried Julian's memories with me like a souvenir in a drawer. I didn't linger on it, but it never completely disappeared. It served as a poignant reminder of the essence of life, the importance of taking risks, and the importance of unconditional love, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. Looking back, I understood that what we had was not about right and wrong. It was about being human, flawed, fragile, and eager for connection in a world that felt both too huge and too cold. And while our time together was brief, it was genuine, it mattered.